Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I want to go over the cell cycle and cell reproduction, talk about what they are. Sometimes you'll see this referred to as cell division, but really it's the life cycle of a cell. And so that's what we're going to cover in this video today. Here's a brief little outline of what I want to go over. We're going to talk about what the cell cycle is, really. Just what is it? I want to go into why it's important. It's always good to know that. Why do we study something? That's, for me, that was a question I always asked. It was hard for me to really get into something if I didn't know why it was important. So I want to talk about that today. I want to go into the stages of the cell cycle, really what they are. They happen in a certain order. So I want to talk about that and what that order is. And then I want to go into just a brief overview of what's happening in each stage. So we'll talk about that in this video today. So let's kind of take a look at this. There's several different studies out there that give different numbers. I've seen some numbers a lot bigger than this, but really, as a human, we produce 2 trillion or more cells every single day. I've seen some studies that even go as high as in the 200 trillions of cells that are produced by humans every single day. That's just an outrageous number. I mean, it's gigantic. If we were to do some math on the 2 trillion number here, looking at that, that breaks down to about 25 million cells per second. I mean, that blows my mind. That number is astronomical, really, when you think about it. And if we really produce 270 trillion cells every day, that number just skyrockets. So think about why that is. If you look at what we do, a lot of your skin is exposed to the elements. You go outside in the heat or the cold, the wind and the rain, and you're bumping into things, and you're walking around and you're brushing your skin against your shoes or your pants or your shirt and all of that. And so your skin's getting all this wear and tear, and so it's got to replace itself because it's getting damaged. Your intestines, as you swallow and digest your food and it goes into your intestine and it actually gets absorbed into your bloodstream, all of that is damaging that intestinal tissue. And so it's got to replace itself. And it can't do that if the cells don't go through the cell cycle. So that's an important part of that. Down here I want to show you guys this. This is one of the main reasons why the cell cycle is important. We all started off life as really an egg and a sperm that came together. The sperm fertilized the egg, the 2 nuclei fused together, and we formed what was called a zygote. A zygote is just a fertilized egg. Well, so we started off life as a single cell. And then that cell divided. And those 2 cells divided. And we had 4. And those 4 cells divided. And we had 8. And we were this little ball of cells called a blastocyst. And those cells weren't specialized. They weren't making skin tissue and nerve tissue or any of that just yet. They were just cells. They had all the chromosomes that it needed, all the DNA and the instructions that were necessary to make you the human that you are today, and they were there. But you're made up of trillions of cells today. So how did that happen? Well, these cells went through the cell cycle. And when they did that, they eventually, after a number of divisions, certain cells, for lack of a better way to really describe it quickly, certain genes turned on and certain genes turned off in other cells. And so those cells became specialized, and that's when you start to see things like skin tissue forming and nervous tissue and cardiac muscle tissue. And we have an embryo, and when that embryo forms, we can start to hear the heartbeat, and we can see the heartbeat when we go to the doctor. And it's all exciting because now we can start to see that specialization of that tissue, and those cells are utilizing certain genes, and proteins are being made, and so forth and so on. But that embryo is still very tiny. And for that embryo to get any larger, the cells that make that up actually have to go through the cell cycle and reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And then we end up with this thing that looks a little bit more like a human now. We have a fetus growing, and that fetus keeps continuing that cell cycle. The cells are dividing and dividing and dividing and making more cells. And then we're born as an infant. And in order for us to get any bigger than we were on our original birthday, if we're made up of cells, the only way we can get bigger is to make more cells. And so that's one of the really important things about the cell cycle. It allows us to grow. As a multicellular organism, the cell cycle is producing more cells and allowing us to get bigger. So you couldn't be this 50 trillion celled organism that you are today without those cells going through the cell cycle, their life cycle of growth and reproduction and producing new cells. So that's an important aspect of that. Another important thing, and that looks painful, is really as a multicellular organism, we damage tissue. We do. We get hurt. We kill cells, we kill tissue, and because not all of the cells that were around this major burn were killed off, that skin tissue will eventually grow back. That person healed. There was a lot of scar tissue, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the tissue that was there that was damaged was replaced with identical cells because of the cell cycle. And so the cell cycle is important for growth, and it's important for multicellular organisms so that we can repair worn out or damaged tissue. So those are the two important things why the cell cycle is really important. This picture down here, just to show you guys, is kind of cool. Shows how trees, since they can't move, this tree couldn't take that rope off. As that tree grows and goes through the cell cycle, you can see that tissue starting to grow over and grow around that rope there. So just another example of the growth part of the cell cycle. So let's actually define this thing. What the cell cycle is, it's the sequence of growth and division that cells go through in their life. Cells will grow, and after a certain while they will divide. And then they form two new cells. And those two new cells will grow and they will divide. And so that's the cycle. That cycle can be broken into a few stages here. The two big ones that we talk about are interphase and mitosis. And so today I want to go into and break these two stages apart. So we're going to look at the parts of interphase and what happens there, and then the stages of mitosis. I've got a separate video that I'm going to go into a lot of detail about mitosis. I'm just going to briefly scrape over the top of that today and talk about why that's important. But I'll go into detail on the stages of mitosis in another video. I want you to look at this image here, this graphic, because I'm going to refer back to it throughout this slideshow, throughout this video. But let's kind of break it apart here. So we can see this part of a circle here is referred to as interphase. And so these three parts right here are the three stages of interphase. We can actually break that down into three different distinct stages here. We have what we call the G1 or GAP1 stage. This is labeled as first growth phase. We have the S stage, or the synthesis phase, and then we have the G2 phase, or GAP2, and it's called the second growth phase here. And then up at the top we have our mitotic phase. So here's interphase, and then here's mitosis. And mitosis itself can be broken down into four parts, and we'll look at that, like I said, in more detail in another video. So let's kind of dive in and look at what happens in each one of these. G1, or GAP1, is what it's referred to as. I know here it's called the first growth phase, and so G you could think of it as growth. It's referred to as the GAP1 phase. And what's going on here, this is really the first part of the cell's life. Because after mitosis, after the mitotic phase, that cell divides. And when it does, now I've got two new cells. You think about that. If I cut a cell in half, I divided it, the two new cells are going to be half the size of that cell. And so they're going to do a lot of growing then. And so that's what happens here in this G1 stage. The cell grows. So it starts off pretty small, and I think this picture is kind of funny. It looks, I didn't put all of this slideshow together here, but you can tell it's the same cell, and it's just been blown up, and then blown up again. But it gets the point across that during this stage, the cell is growing. It's growing, it's producing all the proteins that it needs to specialize that are going to be in the cell membrane that allow things in and out. All the enzymes in the cell that help it digest whatever that specialized cell needs to digest, and it does its job. That's what I want you to know about the G1 phase. The cell grows and it does its job. If it's supposed to be a skin cell, this is when it does the job of a skin cell. If it's an epithelial cell lining your lung, it does the job of the epithelial cell lining your lung. So GAP1, or the G1 stage, is when the cell grows and does what it's supposed to do. When that cell gets to a certain size, when it grows to a certain, it gets too big, it's got parts of that cell that recognize that the growth has hit a certain point and that cell needs to get ready to divide. Well, before it can do that, before it can divide into two new cells, it's got to copy its DNA. And so the next stage of interphase, that after it goes through gap 1, is the cell's going to enter what we call the synthesis phase, the S phase. That's when the DNA gets copied. That's when DNA replication happens. If you've seen my video on DNA replication, you should have an idea of what happens with that in detail. But this is where that takes place. This is when in the cell's life, DNA replication happens. It's when the cell starts really getting ready to divide. This is a lot shorter than the gap 1 phase. I know this image has them kind of divided evenly. Gap 1 really is the longest stage of the cell's life. If you think about it, it's when it's doing its job. So you kind of want it to spend most of its time there. And then DNA replication happens pretty quickly. This is when it makes exact copies of the chromosomes that were in that cell. And once that's done, then the cell goes into the gap 2 or the G2 phase. This is the third part or the last part of interphase here. And at this point, the cell's ready to divide in that it's copied its DNA, it's reached a certain size, and so it really needs to divide. But before it can do that, the cell has to look and make sure that it's produced all of the proteins that it needs for that division. So these proteins that are needed for cell division are going to be produced. Any organelles that need to be duplicated so that each new cell has the right organelles inside of it will have that organelle production will happen there. In animal cells, centrioles will be made, and we'll talk about these centrioles when we do mitosis later on. If you remember back in learning about cell parts and cell organelles, you probably saw centrioles in that. And so during the G2 or the gap 2 phase is when the cell is really preparing for that division, preparing for mitosis. It's a pretty quick stage as well. DNA replication in G2, or the synthesis in G2 stages, happen pretty quickly. But those finish up interphase. And so that's the three parts of interphase that I want you to know. After that is when mitosis happens, the mitotic phase. And really what I want you to know about this is mitosis is just the division of the nucleus. It happens in 4 distinct stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And I've kind of got some pictures of those down here. This is prophase and early metaphase and late metaphase, and then we have anaphase here, and then telophase. But what I want you to see here is mitosis is taking this cell that has one nucleus and going through and actually dividing the DNA, dividing and splitting the chromosomes, so that here we have 2 nuclei that actually have the same exact DNA in them. That's the thing I want you to know about mitosis. It's the division of the nucleus, and it creates 2 genetically identical nuclei. And that's the mitotic stage. We'll go into that in detail, and I'll show you how all that takes place in another video. But that's the mitotic stage. Well, at this point, I can't even talk anymore. I still only have one cell. So what's missing from this picture is the last part that we call cytokinesis. Excuse me. What I want you to know about cytokinesis is it's slightly different in animal cells and plant cells. In an animal cell, there's proteins that will actually pinch off this cell membrane. And so that creates what we call a cleavage furrow, which pinches off and causes that cell membrane to split, and we get 2 new daughter cells that form. And so that's how that happens. In a plant cell, though, we can't pinch that off. It's got a cell wall around it, and that cell wall is not going to break, or it's not going to pinch off like the cell membrane does. So the plant cell is actually going to create a cell plate. It's going to grow, or produce, not really grow, but produce a new cell wall between the 2 nuclei that were formed in mitosis. And so then we end up with 2 new daughter cells that way. And cytokinesis is really that last part of the cell cycle. It happens right there at the end of mitosis, and that's when the 2 new cells are formed. So that's the stages of the cell cycle, interphase and mitosis, and then a little bit of detail about what happens in each. The last thing I wanted to show you is that some cells will actually jump out of this cell cycle and they enter what's called a resting phase, or the G0 phase. And in this part, the cell's not really growing, it's not preparing for division, it's just resting. Some nerve cells will go into this stage, certain muscle cells will go into this stage, and they just kind of do their thing. They don't grow, they don't get any bigger, and they're not getting ready for division. The reason it shows this like this is that sometimes those cells can, because the cells around them were damaged, get back into that cell cycle. But they'll jump off and then jump back in, and that's the G0 stage. hopefully that clears up the cell cycle, and we'll go into the mitosis in a little more detail later.